This is Ed Chapman, and this video cast is going to focus on ecological succession, which is part C of our first unit on ecology. In this video cast, we're going to focus on patterns of aquatic and terrestrial succession in Virginia. We're going to identify similarities and differences between primary and secondary succession, and we're going to describe the characteristics of a climax community. Lots of vocabulary in this segment. Succession, by definition, is a change in plant communities caused by changing factors like the amount of soil, the amount of light, and the amount of moisture in an ecosystem. There are two kinds of succession that you guys need to be worried about. The first kind is primary succession, and the second kind is secondary succession. Now, the good news is they both end, they're both complete when you reach climax. Okay, the climax, let me do a better job spelling that. That wasn't much better, but C-L-I-M-A-X. The climax community is the end of both primary and secondary. And they're actually very similar. There's only a few differences. Now, primary succession starts without soil. So when you have primary succession beginning, you have bare rock. And when secondary succession starts, you have soil present. So it's not that difficult. Just remember, primary succession is rock, secondary succession starts with some soil present. It takes a long time to make soil, so primary succession takes a long time, close in the thousands of years in this area, whereas secondary succession can take place in about 100 years because you already have soil present, and building soil is the lengthy process. Okay, primary succession happens when you have bare rock, and so there's some ways that you can create bare rock in nature. You could have a new volcanic island forming underwater and rising up above the surface of the water. So imagine you have a volcanic eruption with hardening lava, and it finally piles up high enough to actually make an island, and this, of course, is cooled lava, so there's no soil present. Or you could have a glacier. Okay, if you imagine a mountain valley with a big river of frozen compacted snow sliding downhill. This can scrape away all the soil from the valley and create bare rock. Or you can get a landslide. I mean, you can get some rock falling down the side of a mountain and scraping away all the soil, leaving exposed bare rock. Now, the first thing to happen when you have exposed bare rock in primary succession, now remember, now we're talking about primary succession, okay, terrestrial, on land. The first thing that happens is you have some exposed bare rock and some plants start growing on it. Things like mosses and lichens. And mosses and lichens can come in as spores and very small seeds, and they actually can stick to the bare rock in tiny little cracks and crevices and start growing and accumulating some biomass by doing photosynthesis. And as they do that, they start to break down the rock and speed up the process of erosion because they trap moisture. And this can start to produce a really thin layer of sandy soil. Now, once you get some soil present, this thin layer of soil can provide a place for some seeds to germinate. Weedy seeds like grasses can blow in and start growing. And this produces sort of like a carpet of weeds, like something you might see in a yard that hasn't been mowed in a long time. And as the grasses and weeds grow, they create shade. So they start reducing the amount of sunlight hitting the soil. And this also causes more soil to build up, and the soil, as it builds up, can stay moister longer and retain some water because it's not getting as much evaporation and transpiration as it was before because of the shade. And in this environment, we can get some new plant communities coming in, like small seedlings of some trees, especially a type of tree called a pine tree. Pine tree seedlings can grow in fairly dry, thin soils, covering a layer of rock. And after a couple decades, 30, 40, 50 years, you now have an environment dominated by softwood or evergreen trees. These are trees like pine trees and fir trees, Christmas tree type trees. Their seedlings can only grow in full sunlight. So you start getting a young forest being formed. And finally, the last stage is the hardwood stage. And this is when seedlings of oak trees and maple trees and hickory trees and beech trees can grow in the shade cast by the pine trees because their seedlings cannot germinate in full sun. And finally, after 75 to 100 years, you end up with what we call a hardwood forest. Very shady, very little growth underneath the trees. You don't have any grasses. You have very few softwood pine trees. This is the climax community. Okay, so a hardwood forest made up of oak trees, maple trees, trees with big flat leaves. That's the climax community for areas like around Fairfax in Virginia. Now let's quickly take a look at what we're talking about with these trees. Softwood or evergreen trees are also what we call coniferous or cone-bearing trees. These are the trees that have a triangular shape in general, and they produce their seeds inside of structures called cones. They do not have flowers. Okay? Hardwood trees, on the other hand, are deciduous, which means they drop their leaves every fall. They don't keep any leaves over the winter, and these have leaves that are flat. So if you look at the leaves of these trees, they have a vein pattern that spreads out more like the fingers of your hand, whereas evergreen trees have needles. Okay, everybody's seen pine trees. They have needles. All right, so hardwood trees lose their leaves generally in the winter. Evergreen trees have cones, and they tend to keep their needle-shaped leaves over the course of the winter. Softwood trees appear earlier in the stages of succession. Do a better job at that. Oops. These are the species that appear earlier, and these are the ones that appear later, and they're actually the climax species around here. I don't know why I keep forgetting that I. Okay, the characteristics of a hardwood or deciduous forest around here in Virginia is it's dominated by species that are deciduous. They lose their leaves in the fall. Their examples are oak, hickory, and maple, and they provide homes or niches or jobs, so to speak, for animals like owls, bears, wolves, bobcats, foxes, things that can live in the woods. Maybe a few deer here and there, but deer are actually edge species. They live near the edges of woods, and they like to have access to open areas. So the climax community focuses primarily on the plants that are present. Of course, if you have the plants, you can then have the food webs developing, the animals can come in. Secondary succession is just like primary succession, except we have soil. So to start secondary succession, all you have to do is move or get rid of all the plants that are covering the soil. So if you destroy the plants, like with a fire or a flood or plow a field or scrape away all the plants, then you have bare exposed soil, and you can have secondary succession taking place. Secondary succession, for example, in this graphic, after a forest fire, the fire removes all the plant life. Of course, there is still are seeds and roots and bulbs and tubers and things in the soil. So secondary succession can take place on a much quicker time scale. And if everything goes properly, you can get forests and trees in as few as 5 years. And finally, return to the climax community that originally burned in as few as 100 years. This graphic says 150 years. But from what I understand, it only takes between 75 and 100 years in Virginia because of our rainfall. So secondary succession is faster than primary succession, and it starts with soil, not bare rock. Okay, the climax community will remain until something takes it away, like humans or fire or maybe a really, really bad drought or a disease epidemic among the trees or something like that. So to make sure you understand this, what I want you guys to do in your notebooks is describe what prevents the area around our high school from going through secondary succession. We have lots and lots of open areas around the school. What keeps it from becoming forest again? And number two, what are two abiotic factors that prevent secondary succession from jumping directly to a climax community? Why is it such a slow, gradual process? Why can't you go right from pioneer species to climax community? Can you explain this? If you can answer these two questions, then you understand what we mean by terrestrial ecological succession. Okay, aquatic succession, just really quick, is when you change a pond into a swamp, then into a meadow, and then finally into a forest. And this happens when biomass, dead material, accumulates at the bottom of the pond, making it shallower, kind of mucking it up and filling it in. This is really easy to see. Most students don't have too much trouble with this. If you start with a pond that's pretty deep, okay, so this would be our first stage here. You have a pond with not much mud at the bottom. It's got fish and snails and things in it. Then we start building up some soil. So this would be the second the second step down here, where you notice there's more muck, and this will be the third. So now it's shallow enough where plants can start to reach the light, like lily pads and things. And finally, this is the fourth stage, where it's almost completely filled in. The edges are still real swampy and soft. If you walked on it, you'd probably sink. And what'll happen is this will eventually fill in and become swampy, and you get lots and lots of plants growing. And then eventually, as the plants grow and pile up more biomass, then the area isn't a depression anymore, and it becomes really boggy, and you may eventually get a forest. So the point of this is you can have succession take place in an aquatic environment also, especially in things like ponds and ditches, small bodies of water. So we just did that. So it's obvious to see which pond's the oldest. It's the one that's the most filled in. Okay, so draw the 4 stages in your notebook just so you don't forget it. And I think you'll understand, you'll recognize a question asking you something about aquatic succession. All right, we'll stop there. Thanks for listening.